Thanks. Our next section is going to sort of focus in on a specific educational challenge that problems of misinformation raise. We'll be talking about the challenges of teaching climate change. And I'm pleased to introduce Noah Feinstein from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who studies how people make sense of science in their lives and how institutions like schools can help them to do so better. So Noah, over to you.
Hi, everyone. And thanks to the tech folks for putting up with my last minute edits to the presentation. That's always an inconvenience. This is my first time at McGill, and I'd like to extend a thanks to the hosts, to the conference organizers, to all of you for choosing to spend part of your Saturday, to Blaine for choosing to spend part of his sabbatical here responding to my talk. It is a real pleasure. On the subject of welcomes and hosts, I like to begin my talks about climate change with this quote from the citizen Potawatomi philosopher Kyle White, who reminds us that for many indigenous peoples in North America, we are already living in what our ancestors would have understood as dystopian or post-apocalyptic times. Kyle White is a member of the Citizen Potawatomi, a member of the Anishinaabe Three Council Fires, peoples who lived on the margins of this area. I find this to be a compelling grounding for talks about apocalypse, crisis, and climate change. I also want to start by rehearsing this quote from a paper that I wrote with one of the conference co-organizers, Dave Waddington, about post-truth. Conversations about the post-truth era often focus on what people believe, but the anxiety that animates these conversations is often driven by what people do. Any honest conversation about climate change and about climate change education must grapple both with what people believe and what they do. And that will be a theme for the remainder of the talk. Now, in case anyone has to leave early, here are my take-home messages. First of all, teaching climate change and addressing polarization don't mean what we often think they do. The right response to polarization might be, to use an archaic military term, refusing the line, which means refusing to fight at the line of battle established by your adversary. We should think about climate change education as strategic action, the intersection between what we want, what is possible, and what we are capable of doing. And that, I will argue, involving students in adaptation, resilience, and transformation work, what I call art work, could have big practical and educational benefits. Okay, you can all go home now. Fair warning, this is not a talk which is a sober rehearsal of the value of epistemological plurality in the classroom. I could give that talk, but instead, I want to be honest about my priors. The evidence for anthropogenic climate change, ACC, is extremely robust. The threat of ACC is urgent and serious. The harms of anthropogenic climate change will fall most heavily on the oppressed and the vulnerable. There is a moral imperative to prevent the harms we can and prepare for what we cannot. And collective action at many scales is required to accomplish that. It cannot be done by individual action. Those are my priors. I do not expect that all of you will agree with all of them, but the rest of the talk follows from these. I'm now going to begin by unpacking two phrases, the title of this conference and the title of the talk, and showing how a constructive ambiguity in both of those phrases helps us understand what we usually think about when we think about teaching climate change and addressing polarization versus what we might think about and what I believe we should. So, addressing polarization in the classroom is one of the titles. And the challenges of teaching climate change is the other one. Let's start with addressing polarization in the classroom. What exactly are we addressing? I would like to ask you, are we addressing polarization in the classroom, as in polarization that we expect to see in the classroom? Or are we addressing polarization in the classroom? Polarization that might take place outside of the classroom, but we have to manage it, deal with it in the classroom. Let's take each one of those premises in turn. First of all, the notion that we are addressing polarization that we expect to see in the classroom. This is from a 2022 survey run by the Edweek Research Center about the beliefs of 14 to 18-year-olds in regards to anthropogenic climate change. 79% of 14 to 18-year-olds accept the premise that climate change is real and is mainly caused by human activity. In contrast with 3% who disagree with both halves of that premise, 6% who are not sure. 79%. That's pretty impressive. Now, I'm sure there are those among you that would really like that to be 100%. So let me give you a point of contrast. In a YouGov survey of beliefs about the shape of the planet, 66% have always believed the world is round, in contrast to 4% who have always believed the world is flat and 16% who are not sure. Now, this is an apples to oranges comparison. I'm going to say that I think it's much more important that people believe in anthropogenic climate change than the shape of the world, because one of those beliefs has consequences and the other one doesn't. Again, we care about what people do as well as what they believe. But I think it's useful to establish expectations about the amount of consensus that we have right to expect in the context of deliberation in classrooms and elsewhere. And by those standards, we're doing pretty well with young people and climate change. It's not just what they believe. It's also the set of actions they are committed to. Survey after survey, which compare across generations, show that younger generations are more likely to place a high political priority on responding to climate change and are more likely to report being involved in various sorts of climate change civic engagement and action across the private, public, and civic spheres. This may not surprise you, but if it does, it's important information to have. So, young people are already accepting the notion of anthropogenic climate change. They're already, or many of them, are engaged and involved in responding to it, and they want to know more. This is the same 79% survey from Edweek Research Survey Center. Almost 2/3 would like to know more in school about how climate change will affect the future of the Earth and society, in comparison to only 10% who agreed with, I don't want to learn more about any climate change topics or issues in school. Now, I challenge you to present any topic to a set of folks, 14 to 18-year-olds, and get only 10% of them saying, I don't want to learn any more about that in school. All right? So, reviewing our evidence, most young people believe in anthropogenic climate change, are interested in learning more, and many are engaged in and committed to climate advocacy. And crucially, this is not because we've done such a superb job of teaching climate change up to this point in schools. So what polarization in the classroom do we expect exactly? Do we expect to come in, if we could build a wall around our classrooms and just have an honest conversation with the young people present in those classrooms about climate change, would we expect to see them highly polarized? I humbly suggest the answer is no. So then, are we addressing in the classroom the polarization that we know is present outside of the classroom? And that, I would say the answer is yes. Here's one of many charts and figures and graphs I could have shown you. This one comes out of the Yale Climate Change Center, which demonstrates political polarization in the United States about the priority placed on climate change. The top line is folks who affiliate as Democrats. The bottom line in red is folks who identify as Republicans. The middle line in green, independents. And the other chart is whether climate change is a major threat. The degree of political polarization outside the classroom is very clear. I also found this lovely quote about from a Canadian sociological review, which suggests that if you filter out certain variables like trust in political leaders, Canadians' views are actually more driven by ideological position than those of Americans with regards to climate change. I was surprised by that. So then, when we experience that polarization outside of the classroom in our work in the classroom, what that does is it prevents teachers, empirically, it prevents teachers from expressing or acting on their views or what they expect the views their students to have in the classroom, out of fear of the polarization outside of the classroom. Sometimes this fear comes in the form of organized teach the controversy campaigns. Other times it's internalized by the teachers, many of whom have experienced pushback from parents, families, churches, and so forth. At this point, it's important to say that climate polarization is not a grassroots phenomenon. It didn't just happen. Climate polarization is a manufactured phenomenon, the result of a powerful counter-movement, an organized counter-movement, and this gets to some of the points that Lana made in her talk, that effectively challenged the environmental community's definition of global warming as a social problem and blocked the passage of any significant legislation. And that the hyperpolarization among Republicans or right-wing partisans can, in some ways, be attributed to the aggressive and concerted efforts from conservative think tanks and sympathetic media figures. So it is fair to talk about a manufactured dissensus in this context. I would also argue that it's important to understand that opposition to climate action is more about policy than knowledge, and this gets us back to knowing and believing again. So Andrew Hoffman, in his argument about climate change as culture war, says that for skeptics, consistently, climate change is inextricably tied to a belief, perhaps a worldview, that climate science and climate policy is a covert way for liberal environmentalists and the government to interfere in the market and diminish citizens' personal freedom. Or in more pithy terms, James Inhofe said, I was actually on your side of this issue when I was chairing that committee in the US Senate, and I first heard about this. I thought it must be true until I found out what it cost. That's called saying the quiet part out loud. And what it amounts to is not a fight about beliefs, but a fight about action, a fight about policy, which is sometimes fought on the territory of beliefs. So I would argue what addressing polarization means in the context of climate change is responding to widespread political polarization external to the classroom and created by organized interests. That's what addressing polarization means in our on this topic. So, in that context, what are the challenges of teaching climate change? Should we be talking about why teaching climate change is difficult? So, I want to rehearse some points made earlier. Most young people believe in anthropogenic climate change, are interested in learning more, and many are committed to action and advocacy. That makes it easier to teach than a bunch of other topics that we might address, particularly in science education. On the other hand, teaching the science of climate change is really hard, all right? So this is an excerpt from the climate.gov public-facing website about what climate models are, general circulation models. And it notes that they use mathematical equations to characterize how energy and matter interact in different parts of an ocean, atmosphere, land, blah, 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 blah. This is difficult stuff. There's a large number of climate scientists who work in different dimensions of the problem who would readily admit to you that they don't have a very firm grasp of how general circulation models work. I certainly don't. But I would argue to you that the difficulty of teaching this profoundly intricate, remarkable science is actually not unique to climate change. that if you want to get into the high levels of any scientific field, you're going to experience something similar. So then that brings us back to the difficulty being the public controversy, the polarization. Does that mean that we should be talking about the belief in anthropogenic climate change in class? I would argue that rather than talking about that, accepting that as the challenge, we should ask, what does climate change challenge us to teach? Or more specifically, what and how should we teach given the present reality of climate change? Not the scientific abstraction of climate change, not the future potential of climate change, but the present reality of climate change. Now, we might respond to that by saying it's really important for people to understand the physical causes of climate change. Or we might say that climate change challenges us to teach how societies will be affected and how they should respond. Or that it challenges us to teach about how we can prevent climate change from getting worse. These three framings of the problem correspond roughly to the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The physical science basis, Working Group 1, mitigation and adaptation, Working Group 2, impacts and adaptation, and Working Group 3, mitigation. These three reports map out what we might think of as our possibility space. And considering where we want to put our energy within this possibility space, I suggest we consider what education owes the young. Although predominantly caused by the current generation of adults, the worst consequences of climate change will occur during the lifetime of today's children and young people. Research around the world shows that most children and youth know about the climate crisis and are worried about it, and that knowledge leads to all sorts of debilitating, paralyzing, affective states. It's remarkably consistent around the world. So given that, I would say we should consider where to act in the possibility space laid out by the IPCC in strategic terms. And strategic action means answering these three questions. What outcomes do we care about? Where do we have room to act? And what can we actually do? With those questions in mind, here are the IPCC topics. Now, this, I would argue, the physical science basis, is where education usually feels most comfortable. It's also where a few key victories have been won. In the United States, for example, the insertion of climate change into the next generation science standards and the acceptance of those standards in, or some version of them, in 47 or 49 states, depending on how you count, represents a singular victory. But this is also, I would suggest, where the anti-climate lobby wants to have the fight. And they don't want to have the fight about climate change beliefs that teach the controversy fight because they care about what people believe. They want to have that fight because they care about policy, because they care about what people do and how they vote. Teachers are also extremely cautious about this. Now, I'm saying this in part recognizing that I'm speaking to an audience of teachers, and so you all may have different views. But in my experience, and in my read of the literature, science teachers in the United States are extremely hesitant to bring up topics that touch on policy, especially when those topics have been tagged as partisan, which climate change has. So if this is the fight that we're used to having and that the anti-climate lobby wants to have, and that other one, the mitigation fight, is the fight that they're trying to avoid, but that we're hesitant to have, what does that lead us with? It leaves us with this middle topic, impacts and adaptation, an area where very little work is going on in schools. I would argue that the problem of impacts and adaptation has been extremely poorly and incompletely constructed as an educational enterprise in and out of schools. but there are some lovely counterexamples. Before I go on to those counterexamples, I want to talk briefly about adaptation, because folks working in climate change will tell you that the word adaptation is fraught, and there are many folks that problematize it. I would argue that it's useful for us to think about adaptation, resilience, and transformation or transition as different ideas, and we need all of them, hence the notion of artwork, ART work. In a 2020 paper, the climate scientist Catherine Mock and I argued that there are three values of education, conceived broadly as systematic support for learning in promoting climate change adaptation. One of them is by using the vast infrastructure of education to improve rather than detract from the resilience of societies. The second, especially in low and middle income countries, is by supporting excellence in general education, which studies tend to show also promotes resilience. And the third, and what we'll be talking about mostly today, is the idea of adaptation learning support, building adaptive capacity across contexts. And this is where the examples come in. My read of the research, which is preliminary at this point, is that projects that directly involve young people in adaptation, resilience, and transformation lower climate anxiety and despair, build relational empowerment, develop important skills and social capital while addressing real community needs, and potentially solving some of the established problems of science and social studies or civics education. Here's a partial bibliography for that, in case anyone wants one. This one needs updating. It's 2022. What I would point out to you, the text is probably too small for you to read, is that if you were to scan down these journals, you would see that these journals come from a wide range of fields, and that is interesting. From my very idiosyncratic scholarly perspective, that increases the robustness of the claim, because it suggests that rather than this being a faddish proposition of educational researchers, that people in many different fields are semi-independently discovering that involving young people in this kind of work has all kinds of interesting consequences. All right. Now some examples. In California, in the San Francisco Bay Area, the Mycelium Youth Network, a grassroots youth organization, which you can contribute to online, should you be so inclined, works with communities and schools to embed climate resilience content into the curriculum and instructional projects of K-12 teachers. In Michigan, the Southeast Michigan Stewardship Coalition does something very similar, although they are much less just explicitly justice-oriented and use much more of a familiar place-based citizen science, civic science lens. The Collective Resilience Network turns the notion of green schools inside out, asking not how schools generate energy, but how schools can help their communities become more resilient in the face of climate-provoked disaster, the climate crisis. This gets back to the infrastructure question of education and adaptation. And outside of schools, the network of organizations collectively known as Groundwork USA has instigated many projects, including their Climate Preparedness and Land Restoration Initiative, which involves young people in projects like bioswale, rain gardens, tree canopy planting, urban heat island mitigation, and so on and so forth. All of this is to say this is stuff that we can do. It's not impossible. And if you were to comb through each of those projects, you as educators would recognize a lot of terms. You'd recognize place-based education. In Canada especially, the framework of STSE, Science, Technology, Society, and Environment, achieved considerable prominence back in the, 80s, 90s? Socioscientific issue discussion, a common pedagogy in the United States. The old idea of phenology, tracking changes in the occurrence of particular species and the timing in which those occurrences appear. Green Schools Alliances, citizen science, more recent ideas like designing for rightful presence or active citizenship education. These are the familiar pieces from which a new sort of climate change education might be built. I have not tracked my time at all. I don't know how I'm doing. It looks like I'm over. So let me just leave for conversation that we should think about how the approach that I've suggested aligns with our values. We should think about what footholds already exist within our contexts, which piece of this we could run with. What are the obstacles to this kind of work in our context? Am I wrong in saying that this would be less polarizing than focusing on greenhouse gas emission? What resources, infrastructure, or partnerships are needed to make it happen? If I were to sum up my talk tonally, what I would say is this: teaching climate change isn't like teaching evolution. It's like teaching emergency medicine in a working field hospital. And if we approach the problem that way, instead of being a problem about politically dangerous knowledge, that will achieve more of what we want and what our students deserve. That's what I got.
Thanks, Noah, and you're actually wrong. You were well within your time limit. Appreciate that. And thanks for the interesting talk. I'm going to introduce next Blaine Harvey, my colleague in DICE, William Dawson Scholar here at McGill, and Director of the Culture and Sustainability Leadership and Learning. Sorry, I had it on my phone, but my phone died. Sorry about that. Blaine.
Thanks so much, and it's great to hear the talk and to meet you and get to know you through this session. Thanks everybody who's joined us today, and it's really exciting to have the opportunity to talk about some of these issues in a forum like this. It's always a little bit difficult to respond to a talk around which you agree with so much, but I'll do my best to kind of draw out some points and also to raise a few questions that I hope will foster some of the dialogue as we move forward. I'm going to keep these fairly brief, and I think the sort of at the essence of what I want to be talking about is could it be both and rather than either or that we think about when we think about the way that we respond to the climate crisis and its kind of multitude of implications. In doing so, I might also ask, could we think about polarization and how we address it, not only in the classroom, but in the school, thinking of school as having agency that goes beyond its relationship with the children that sit within the four walls of the classroom, and rather the school as kind of agent of change and dialogue within the communities in which it's embedded, within the networks of other schools and other educational institutions that form a kind of global tapestry around like the future we are co-producing for future generations. I think, as Noah mentioned, the sort of thought that comes to my mind to borrow from Greta Thunberg, and I think it's the first time I've ever done that, but whatever. How do we teach when our house is on fire? What does it mean to think about it in what we often think about as climate emergency, but are cautioned by scholars and philosophers like Mike Hume to avoid the trappings of emergency politics, which lead us to short-term solutions, to kind of closing down political discourse, to moving kind of away from the messiness at times towards the sort of the fastest kind of or kind of near closest line between points A and B. And what does that mean when we bring kind of some of those implications into the classroom? Noah, your talk kind of talked about the potential benefits of engagement in making real world changes at a scale that is tangible, perceivable, and approachable for young people. And our own research here at McGill that we've been doing, as Kevin mentioned, I lead a group called Leadership and Learning for Sustainability, where we explore many of these questions here at McGill and in the surrounding areas. Confirms some of the things that you've talked about. We looked at kind of what is needed to build critical and transformative understandings of some of these wicked social challenges like food security, biodiversity crises, and climate change within students, within learners. And three things that stood out for us were learning and acting beyond the classroom, which I think you captured very well within your presentation, and two others that I think maybe I'll try to introduce into this. Centering equity and justice actually turned out to be very important to kind of contextualize this local action and what it means. So it's one thing to get out there and be kind of working on a garden. What does that garden mean when brought into the light of highly inequitable food security, global supply chains, and injustices that are tied to rights to access to and quality of food, just to name one example. And thirdly, and maybe for us, engaging with our peers across boundaries, disciplinary, epistemological, worldview, and so on. And that together, these three are critical ingredients that interact with one another to create transformative outcomes. So a question to like my moment of critique or of engagement on this is to pose the question, what then of the deeper systemic, structural, political change that we know we need to see? Does engaging at the local and bringing students in and learners into their backyards to work on this in some way perhaps constitute an abandonment of engagement with the broader corporate state and economic forces that are driving inaction? In the vacuum created by the absence of educational engagement with these more structural matters, do we perhaps create the space for create more space or seed space for others who would craft a narrative justifying climate delay, to use the words of William Lamb, and I'll come back to those. And does education not have a role and a responsibility to uphold within that space of looking at those higher orders of injustice, of global inequity, and of the forms of capital that are the sort of the exercise of capital on our futures that were touched upon so nicely in the previous talks? Coming back again, I think to the question of like, how do we explain this and how do we engage with the sort of the discourses that frame the way we think about climate change, whether that is one of action or understanding, whether that is one that is asking us about whether we, sorry, I'm just catch myself. These are notes that I took just in listening to the last talk. So I want to make sure I'm getting this right. I guess I raised the question, could there be more than one explanation? And could these different explanations of the way we're reading the current moment invite different responses in the forms of engagement that we undertake? Here, I think I return again to Lamb et al.'s paper on the discourses of climate delay. They come up with 4 categories of delay that I think span different kind of discursive and epistemic kind of systems that that we must take into account. The first is that it's not possible, which it kind of brings us into social and scientific kind of domains. The second is that change is not necessary, perhaps a scientific claim in some ways. That change will be disruptive, which gets us into personal and societal kind of responses or considerations of the rightness or the ways to respond. And lastly, that someone else should act first, a deeply political claim around who bears responsibility for changing the situation that we find ourselves in. And I wonder whether we may want to actually kind of nuance the ways that we respond to each of those categories of discursive categories of delay to, in some cases, be quite outright in contesting them and challenging them and not shying away from engaging with the controversy. And in others, creating space for dialogue that actually seeks to better understand the experiences that are kind of feeding some of those claims, such as change will be disruptive, which we see in areas that are resource dependent, economically marginalized, and often kind of have a long tradition of being excluded from political process. Do we treat that the same way as claims that change is not possible? And here I think that what I want to claim, and I want to sort of invite not only for classes, schools, in our schools, but also in dialogues like these. I think for me, this calls for the importance of interdisciplinary dialogue around these issues. We sit in this space of very common kind of educational and theories of education, philosophies of education, coming to kind of understandings that we believe shine light on the best ways forward around this, as, and in the earlier talks just kind of pointed to, colleagues down the hill or across the way are engaged in their own dialogues, coming to their own kind of tidy conclusions about how best to address this. And to me, this calls for really a closer and more complex engagement across kind of epistemic, political, economic, and scientific discourse communities that try to understand what we can kind of gain from each other, where the tensions sit in the ways that we're reading both the climate crisis and the ways that we respond to it or respond to those who kind of diminish, deny, or kind of deflect attention from it. The way that we would respond to the Monsantos, the ExxonMobils, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers probably should differ dramatically from those communities who are worried about kind of the state of their future, or the fact that teaching about climate change may distract from other equally or perhaps more arguably more important priorities that they see within their everyday. We often see this, I work a lot in international development. We often see this in bringing climate change resilience building projects to communities who are saying, my problem as I see it isn't climate change, it's my joblessness. Or my problem isn't climate change, it's my land tenure. And so trying to think about how we don't see that as denialism or disengagement, but rather a reflection of a quite different lived reality that we need to account for, engage with, and acknowledge. And I want to conclude by kind of coming back to that a little bit, but also to say from an educational perspective that this invites, in my mind, what you've proposed and what we're talking about today, a fundamentally different relationship with young people as agents of local transformation than our schools are currently set up to accommodate. It's hardly unique to responding to the climate crisis, but I think it's really central to the way we think about what to do next and what we could do next. Could adoption of could it serve as both a possibility and a way to drive broader change that we know is needed? Could the adoption of a perspective on climate action through local adaptation, resilience, and transformation art, as you describe it, stand to serve wider projects of engaged community-based learning? Or conversely, could this work be catalyzed through alignment with projects that are happening under other banners already within our communities? Could we be thinking about the intersection of homelessness and climate change, of food insecurity and climate change, of biodiversity loss and climate change in ways that actually catalyze the conversation on climate change and move it forward? Maybe this invites more intersectional readings of climate change that connect it with other forms of social, political, economic marginalization that we see every day. My point here, in part, is that sometimes what we observe is that climate change seems to compete with other important social issues to see what gets time, what gets priority, what gets airing within it. And that I see this as a deeply unhelpful way of thinking about how we address the sort of many dimensions of social justice and social inequity within the classrooms, and perhaps this more intersectional reading of how we act on climate change that could be kind of the seeds of which could be sitting in the proposals that you're talking about, could actually be an important leverage point, not only for action on climate, but action on kind of multiple forms of social inequity and injustice. And if we're thinking deeply about resilience, risk, and vulnerability, actually this kind of inequity, this kind of focus becomes not only good to have, but essential to have. I want to close my thoughts here with what I think I'm proposing as a kind of, it comes from a quote on from an adult education scholar, which is interesting since we're here talking about young people, but I think it's also relevant to climate change education. This is from Lindemann, who says that, and I'll adapt it, that climate change education will become an agency of progress if its short-term goal of self-improvement, community improvement, local improvement can be made compatible with a long-term, experimental, but resolute policy of changing the social order. So my invitation in thinking about both and rather than either or is, can we hold both of those horizons in focus simultaneously in order to inspire youth to act, but to not lose sight of what's driving many of these forces in the first place? Thanks very much.
I just want to check something. Thanks, Blaine, very much. Are we really, it seems like we have time for a more extended discussion this time. It's, we're due to finish at 11:30, so that's good. I just wanted to, sort of in the spirit of some of the comments near the end of Blaine's talk, about interdisciplinarity and the importance of that, avoiding siloization, give a shout out to, the teacher fellows that we've invited to participate in the conference, and be really interesting to hear from you. And it's not just the teacher fellows who have experience in schools and other educational environments. Some of the graduate student discussion facilitators that we've invited are also teachers or former teachers, some of the speakers. So, one of the sort of foci of this conference is to sort of bring together, theorists and practitioners to think about solutions. And I think there was lots of food for thought in the two talks. So, please, just to welcome you into the discussion, and please put up your hands if you have a thought or a question.
Okay, folks, I'll come around with the mic here for anybody who might want to ask a question.
I had a conversation recently with an emergency doctor, and I think it was funny because we talked about that. And he was saying that what he hated the most about his job is that once all the tests are done, once the blood is okay, the scan is okay, but people are still in pain, his job ends. There's no intersection with other specialists that would come in the room and be like, maybe this is a psychological problem or a psychiatric problem, right? And my question is, and this is for my personal practice as an educator, is how can we find ways in a Western society where everything is labeled and sectioned to find ways to implement intersection in solving problems, such as problems of environmental issues, right? Because if we see them only through one eye, but our brains are already wired and seeing things in one way, how can we as educators have our students or ourselves develop these qualities?
So Noah and Blaine, do you guys want to respond to that question?
It's a fantastic question. And I think it resonates with Blaine's comment about a more both and approach in terms of thinking both about what's needed now and what broader transformations will help us fix the bigger messes that have resulted in the crisis that we face. The need for emergency medicine doesn't mean there's no need for public health. We definitely need policies to change the social determinants that push people into the emergency room to begin with. I think that in thinking about what I wanted to say today, I thought a lot about possibility space. I thought a lot about what can be done in each context. And I think that there's an extent to which that's not a systemic question. It's a very local question. It's what can be done in your teaching context, what can be done in your community context. And where climate change is concerned, climate change is not an environmental problem. It's not just an environmental problem. I wish we could avoid the word environment in talking about it, actually. But where climate change is concerned, I feel like the answer to what should be done is as much as you can do, as much as can be done. If you can address the root causes and the social transformations that are necessary, then by all means go there. But we fled so often into abstraction, into disciplinary abstraction in talking about climate change. And this speaks to your question of silos. Um, I think it's tempting for us to say, well, what does the science say about this? And then just stay in that. Or to accept the STEM rubric and say it's scientific problems, technological solutions, instead of building the collaborations we need with the civic process, with humanistic understandings of the world. Um, so I think that part of the refusing the line is refusing the line of the disciplinary abstraction as well.
Maybe just a little addition, and I think this is something that we often talk about in terms of how do you teach in this kind of joined up and kind of way, where those things appear, where we see kind of interdisciplinarity and complexity in its kind of fullest kind of articulation is in the real world. And I think engaging with the real world kind of nature of challenges is one of those ways that we kind of throw off the sort of the boundaries. Oh, you're not allowed to see that because it's not in the curriculum. We have a garden. So there's a plug. Right over there down the stairs is a little urban garden that we've been kind of growing, so to speak. And one of the things that we have been trying really hard to do is avoid it becoming the space where science ed kind of goes and talks about the plant cycle exclusively. It's great if they do because we want it to be used more, but it's also where we do interpretive dance or yoga or poetry or things like that that invite us to think about our relationship with nature as being kind of on multiple planes, with multiple kind of ways of knowing, seeing, and being. And that can be just sort of a testament to the way that kind of real world spaces invite us to do that. Maybe one other plug, and there's somebody in the room, Stephanie, I'll just call you up because you've actually been working with school curricula that are built around the sustainable development goals and real world challenges to sort of throw disciplines or subject areas out the window and rethink curriculum from that. So I sit here as a university professor talking about things. Somebody who sits as a school teacher might be able to sort of speak about what that looks like in practice in a more kind of tangible sense. So invitation to have a chat.
All right, who's next?
Good morning. My name is Umaswa David. I'm a PhD student here at McGill. And my questions would be to Professor No. I liked your talk. You are a very good teacher. And first one is the faces you showed on the climate change local activities. They were more like people of color. Is there an explanation for that? And two, yes, I understand that there is a need to teach young people in the long run, but are they really the targets of those who cause the problem? And what are we doing to those who are really the major actors who cause the problems? Thank you.
The reason for showing the pictures that I showed is that those are the pictures that are put out by the organizations whose work I think is superb and that I wish to highlight. Those are the audiences with whom they work and the people who constitute their staff. It so happens that in this sector of what's sometimes called climate justice education in the United States, and work on resilience and community resilience is often done in communities that are more ethnically, racially, and culturally diverse. Those are the communities that are doing the work. They are also the people who are most affected. And that's true both on a global scale and within any one country. Any intersectionally vulnerable group is going to be the group which is most vulnerable to climate impacts. And the people who do resilience and adaptation and transformation work, not just because they're brilliant and insightful, but because they face the urgent challenges of the climate crisis to begin with. So those are the reasons why. So the simple answer is I showed those pictures because that's what the organizations put on their websites, and the organizations put those on their websites because that's who they work with. But there's a longer answer behind that. In regards to asking young people to shoulder the burden when they didn't cause the problem, for me, this is this is one more big reason why I think the turn towards towards artwork, adaptation, resilience, and transformation work with young people is very important, because they are. There's some research that shows, and this is also now a lot of anecdote from talking to climate activists around the world, young climate activists, is that there is a pretty close connection between working on global problems of climate mitigation policy and the experience of burnout, rage, disempowerment, and so on and so forth. The relationship of the sort of environmental establishment to youth climate activists is an incredibly patronizing and paternalistic relationship, often, which sort of celebrates their activity and holds them up and brings them to spaces in which they have no hope of making a difference, like the Conference of Parties. And the work of doing adaptation, resilience, and transformation is a life skill that all of us should be developing. And the longer we expect to live, the more important it is for us to develop it. So for me, that work is not so much a matter of asking people to shoulder responsibility for a crisis that they didn't cause, as it is of making them agents in a world in which they have no choice but to live, because it's the only world we have.
Not sure I have anything else to add other than, yeah, I think just to echo your point on there's a Peter Taylor and Alfredo Ortiz or Aragon wrote a piece saying building up people's capacity to recognize and diagnose the crisis they find themselves in, whilst leaving them with absolutely no capacity to affect change on the circumstances that shape their situation in that crisis, is tantamount to an act of violence against them. Is like, here's your problem. It's a shame you can't do anything about it. And so this can lead to high levels of burnout and so on. I think transformation, though, as we think about transformation, we need to be thinking about sort of the political dimensions of transformation that kind of doesn't accept that as a given, but rather seeks to upend that as a sort of a dynamic that we find ourselves in. And so asking ourselves, how do we contest the position that young people have been placed within these global frameworks, and not simply kind of work with it as a sort of as an established or an accepted kind of state of affairs.
All right, who's up next? Oh, we've got more than one microphone on the go. How great is this?
Hi, my name is Nestle. I'm a PhD student, but in education, but I want to ask my question as a teacher. I agree with everything you said, and I'm so thankful that you use that phrase that climate change is not an environmental issue. I see it the same, it's intersectional. But at the same time, I feel as a teacher so overwhelmed because what does that do with teaching climate change? Where is it located in school? How can teachers themselves realize that climate change is an intersectional issue? And what does that do to teacher training? I know a lot of questions, but that's basically what I want to know as a teacher.
That's a hell of a question. I think it's really important that in thinking about teaching climate change and the challenges of teaching climate change, that we not think about it as one more thing that teachers have to do. And that the notion that there are a lot of old pieces from which a climate change education might be built, I think, is the approach to the curriculum as well. It's not so much what do you have to add, but what topics are you already obliged to teach under which you can create space to do this work. If you're doing phenology, if you're doing water cycles, if you're doing whatever, or in the United States, people often work in middle school classrooms, the middle grades classrooms, 6th and 7th grade, especially to do this stuff, in part because that's where the curriculum already directs people to talk about planetary systems. And so at that point, people are already talking about it. And then climate change in its social and environmental complexity becomes a case where you can do the stuff that you're obligated to do anyhow. Um, I think that there's a certain amount of um, puckishness, mischief required, where we recognize. I think all teachers do this. There's some work and sort of a resistance to the phone book's worth of curriculum that's slapped down on their desk every year, where they sort of have to pick and choose. Everyone knows you have to pick and choose. You have to cover everything, but you don't have to cover everything the same. And some boxes you can check off in a relatively short amount of time, or that sort of work. How do you create space? The question of how you create space to do this kind of work in within the bounds and the containers of the work that you're obliged to do. And I think a practical question, which I would throw back to you and to your colleagues in the room, what resources could help you do that? Because all of those slides that I showed were slides that were about organizations that were partners. 3 of them are explicitly partners for formal educational systems. Um, and I think that those partnerships can create a lot of space for work, can help you take the scant time and resources that you do and do something good with it. So you don't have to create the case or the project or whatever it is that your students are working in. So that's what I'd love to know is what partnerships are needed.
Blaine, do you want to have anything you want to add?
I really echo this point about partnerships. I think they can be some of the greatest seedbeds for kind of like transformative kind of practice. But I want to come on the thing that you mentioned just at the end there around teacher education, as we sit in the Faculty of Education, and as I speak as somebody who's been trying for, I don't know how many years to get a climate change education course consistently in the books. Unsuccessfully thus far within our own. So pointing the finger at ourselves. We often, I think of the problem as located at a singular scale. What do I do in the classroom? And I think one of the important things is to start thinking about, and as teachers, I think, are often kind of very caught up in thinking about like the nature of the problem at the scale that they're operating at, rather than thinking about, okay, and then we can point up, well, yeah, it's the curriculum, and then the curriculum is like, well, it's the ministry, and up we go until nobody's responsible for the problem. And this is we see this happening kind of in all sorts of fields. We've created a bit of a diagrammatic representation of how that looks here, where we think about, the reality of my classroom and the constraints and enablers that I have in the space that I manage or I lead or whatever, sitting within a department, which sits within a faculty, which sits within a university, which sits within a sort of a set of disciplinary expectations and norms, and trying to locate the sort of like the crux of the problem at any one of those leads us to frustration, I would argue. And so it's about thinking in that cross-scalar way of saying, okay, we need to change things at multiple scales kind of simultaneously. Sorry, it creates like a more complicated solution, but I think often lasting solutions are complicated, and they are kind of what we need to be looking at. And dialogues like these that do kind of try to bring teachers with faculty members, with administrators and others are a good starting point for sort of like painting the contours of that, I think.
Other questions? Sure. Kristen, I'll just bring you the mic.
Thanks. I'd like to just politely push against the idea of bringing climate education in where it fits. And I think this is something that we just lived here in Quebec with the sex education curriculum, where for many years it was, like we'll bring it in where there's an organic fit. And where my question is how does that fight against this siloing idea? Because I think that when we're given curriculum in contexts like that, with the encouragement to stick it in where it fits, it ends up disproportionately becoming siloed, sex education to things like science or English, for instance, where we can kind of create these opportunities, but it doesn't promote interdisciplinarity. So I'm just wondering if there's any ideas about this, because in the context of sex education, for instance, we've just moved to putting it all into one course here in Quebec, because I think that the approach didn't end up playing out. So I'm, with the extreme time sensitivity of a topic like climate change and climate action, how do we avoid that siloing if that's the approach coming down?
I mean, just to add a little bit of additional context to Kristen's question. I mean, so in Quebec, and this is more for you, Noah, there was this effort to say, well, we're going to treat sex education as a kind of cross-curricular question. We're going to teach it across several different subjects and not teach it as a standalone. And this effort turned out to be pretty disastrous, because making it cross-curricular effectively meant that it was just diluted and an afterthought in almost every case. So I think that especially for Quebec teachers, there's a lot of resistance to making things cross-curricular, because they kind of have learned by dint of hard experience that making it cross-curricular means that, well, it just kind of falls off the priority list.
In a higher ed context, I think about this as the ethnic studies question, which is, do you want the department, or do you want courses that deal with it throughout the curriculum? And the response in American higher ed has been both and. Both and. And I think that encouraging people to find space within what they do, from my perspective at least, is a recognition of the necessity of making do in the systems in which we currently live, given that curricular reform is so freaking slow. Policy change is so slow. So if the question one asks is, what system would we prefer? Do we want dedicated time for this work? Do we want dedicated space for this work? The answer is yes. But if the question is, what can you do in the moment that you have? The necessity of making do is there. And finding, there's a sociologist, colleague of mine who passed away recently, named Eric Olin Wright at UW-Madison, who wrote a book called Envisioning Real Utopias. And Wright talks about interstitial change strategies. And he's writing about capitalism, actually. He's writing about how do we envision alternatives to capitalism in a world in which there seem to be no coherent alternatives. And then he proceeds to sort of sketch out the different things that people have done around the world as alternatives to late capitalism. And many of those are very humble experiments. But the possibility, the potential of a humble experiment created in the space which is provided to then take on broader life is something that might give us hope. An example in the United States context in a very different issue is that the first engineering curriculum in US context, for those who care about engineering in schools or design in schools, was a career and technical education curriculum. It was a vocational curriculum, because engineering had been crowded out of everything else, and the only space where it could fit was either in the enrichment of the sort of folks who had already jumped through all the hoops, mostly because of privilege, or in the career and technical education for the people who weren't considered to be college bound. So what could they do? And that Project Lead the Way, became a model for engineering and design education when policy changed and created space for it for a much broader range of students. So I think interstitial change is an ugly necessity. It's what we have to do. It's a space that we have to work while we push for policy change. I think, again, it's both and, but while we're stuck without the policies that we want, we shouldn't do nothing. I don't think any of us think we should do nothing. And so being mischievous in the ways that we can, the teachers always are productively mischievous, is important, essential.
There's one more question.
I was going to say, we have time for one more question. So maybe since actually the microphones are here, sorry, but allow time for that. And then we'll take our coffee break and have the last session of the morning.
So I was just, oops, sorry. Really appreciating the silo problem. That's really amazing. And I love the use of the word mischief, because if we wait for the next, or that's even assuming there's goodwill to even do that in the first place, which maybe there is and maybe there isn't. So what I was wondering was, is there something where I know some schools here have, for instance, the International Baccalaureate certificate students will take. It's concurrent with their other classes. What if like we had something like in math class? Don't no more examples of train living at this time and going, but every example in math has to do with climate change. I don't know if in English classes, now I don't know this, and I guess this is where people are more experts in this. You don't get rid of all the great novels, but maybe one of them can change and have something to do with issues related to climate change. So we've got the math examples, and you're still teaching that curriculum. It's just tailor your examples. Is there some place where people can go where you get, because again, institutionally, maybe not, what if you got like a small group of teachers in the different subjects where like, I'm committed to I'm still covering everything, but tailoring it to bring awareness, to bring ideas. And so then maybe that translates to the curriculum outside the classroom, right? So the leadership teacher addresses some things, and then it also becomes the theme for the prom or whatever the case may be. Is there already something like this that exists that they could sort of latch on to?
Thanks, Eric. It's 11:30, maybe a little bit past, but we are having in the next session small group discussion sessions where we can pick up on these and other questions that come up. So why don't we take a break? And I think the discussion session starts at 11:40. Am I right, Dave?